Officer James Mercer wiped sweat from his brow as the summer sun beat down on his patrol car. The streets of Los Angeles shimmered with heat waves, creating mirages on the asphalt ahead. His partner, Officer Ramirez, sipped from a water bottle, scanning the traffic with experienced eyes. "Another quiet day," Mercer mumbled, turning onto Wilshire Boulevard. That's when they spotted it, a sleek, black custom sports car with windows tinted so dark they appeared nearly opaque. The vehicle stood out, not just because of its obvious expense, but because something about it didn't quite follow regulations. "Check that out," Ramirez pointed, sitting up straighter. "Those windows are way beyond legal tint limits. And is that an aftermarket exhaust?" Mercer nodded, flicking on the patrol car's lights. The sports car continued for another block before slowly pulling to the curb. Both officers noticed how the expensive vehicle settled unusually low to the ground, clearly modified with custom suspension. "This could be interesting," Mercer said, reaching for his hat. "These luxury car owners think rules don't apply to them." The two officers approached with caution, one on each side of the vehicle. Standard procedure, especially when you couldn't see who was inside. Mercer tapped on the driver's window with his knuckles, but the glass remained up. He could make out a large shape behind the wheel, but nothing clear. "Police officers, please lower your window," Mercer called out, hand instinctively moving closer to his belt. After several tense seconds, the window lowered just 3 inches, not enough to provide a clear view of the driver. "License and registration, please," Mercer said, trying to peer inside. A deep voice rumbled from within. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" "Your windows exceed the legal tint limit in California, and we need to check your vehicle modifications. Please step out of the car, sir." The voice inside sounded annoyed. "I'm running late for an important meeting. Can't we handle this quickly?" Ramirez exchanged glances with Mercer. They'd heard every excuse in the book. Rich people in expensive cars often try to talk their way out of tickets. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle now," Mercer repeated, his tone firmer. The engine suddenly revved, not aggressively, but enough to startle both officers. Mercer stepped back, hand now resting on his holster. Ramirez spoke rapidly into his radio, calling for backup. "Turn off the engine immediately," Mercer shouted. The engine went quiet, but the standoff continued. 3 minutes passed without the driver exiting. Protocol for non-compliance kicked in, and Mercer made a decision that would change the course of his career. "Sir, if you don't exit the vehicle now, we'll have to treat this as a high-risk stop and impound your vehicle." No response came from inside. 2 more patrol cars arrived, blocking the sports car from behind and in front. Traffic slowed as passing drivers rubbernecked to see what was happening. Officer Wong from the backup unit approached Mercer. "What's the situation?" "Driver with heavily modified vehicle refusing to comply with instructions," Mercer explained. "We're going to have to impound it." Wong nodded and made the call for a tow truck. None of the officers realized that inside the custom car sat one of the most recognizable sports figures in America. They had no idea they were about to create a story that would spread across the country by nightfall. The tow truck's yellow lights flashed as it backed up toward the sports car. The officers prepared for the standard impoundment procedure, completely unaware of who they were dealing with and the storm that was about to break. The tow truck driver, a weathered man named Eddie with 20 years of experience, lowered his equipment and approached Officer Mercer. "So what's the story with this beauty?" Eddie whistled, admiring the sleek lines of the custom sports car. "Shame to impound something like this." "Driver won't comply," Mercer explained, keeping his eyes on the vehicle. "We've given multiple warnings." Inside the car, the situation was quite different from what the officers imagined. Shaquille O'Neal shifted uncomfortably in his custom-designed seat. Even with modifications, the space felt cramped for his 7'0" frame. He reached for his phone, quickly texting his manager. "Police trouble. Car getting towed. No joke." His manager replied instantly. "Don't move. I'm calling our lawyer now." Shaq sighed heavily. He'd been through similar situations before. People not recognizing him immediately, and then the awkward moment of realization. But this was escalating faster than usual. He decided to wait for legal advice before making his next move. Outside, the growing collection of patrol cars had attracted attention. Pedestrians gathered at a safe distance, Phones raised to record what was happening. One young woman squinted at the car and gasped. "Is that Shaq's car?" she said loudly to her friend. "I swear I've seen it on Instagram." Her comment wasn't loud enough to reach the officers, who were now discussing how to proceed. The standard protocol for a non-compliant driver involved careful steps to ensure everyone's safety. Officer Ramirez used the patrol car's loudspeaker. "Driver, this is your final warning. Exit the vehicle slowly with your hands visible." Inside, Shaq received a text from his lawyer. "Stay calm. Tell them who you are. Don't make sudden moves." He texted back, "They can't even see me. Windows too dark." The tension outside continued to build. Officer Wong placed spike strips behind the car's rear tires as a precaution. The tow truck moved into position. Preparing to secure the vehicle, Eddie called out, moving toward the front of the sports car. That's when Shaq decided he couldn't wait any longer. He pressed the button to lower all windows completely. Bright sunlight flooded the car's interior. Officer Mercer approached cautiously, finally able to see inside. His eyes widened as they traveled upward, taking in the massive frame that seemed to fill the entire driver's compartment. "I'm Shaquille O'Neal," the deep voice announced calmly. "There seems to be a misunderstanding here." Mercer stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. Was this really happening? Was he actually about to tow NBA legend Shaq's car? Officer Ramirez approached from the passenger side, equally stunned. "Sir, we didn't." A woman from the growing crowd shouted, "That's Shaq. They're trying to tow Shaq's car." Phones captured everything as murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Some people booed the officers, while others called out Shaq's name in support. Eddie, the tow truck driver, stepped back, recognition dawning on his face. "Man, I almost towed Shaq. My kids would never forgive me." Officer Mercer cleared his throat, attempting to regain his professional composure. "Mr. O'Neal, we need to see your license and registration. Your window tint exceeds legal limits." Shaq reached slowly for his glove compartment. "I understand you're doing your job, officer, but maybe we could have worked this out before calling in the cavalry." A news van pulled up at the edge of the gathering crowd. A reporter and cameraman jumped out, rushing toward the scene. Officer Wong noticed and groaned. This is about to become a media circus. "Too late," Ramirez muttered, seeing more people recording with their phones. "By dinner time, everyone in America will think we tried to burn Shaquille O'Neal's car." The tow truck's lights continued flashing, creating a dramatic backdrop as Shaq carefully handed his documents to Officer Mercer. Both men knew that what happened next would be seen by millions. Officer Mercer studied Shaquille O'Neal's license with a growing sense of dread. There was no mistake. The giant of a man in the driver's seat was indeed the NBA legend. Mercer's hand trembled slightly as he compared the photo to the face looking at him. The enormity of the situation was sinking in. "Everything seems to be in order, Mr. O'Neal," Mercer said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But your vehicle still has several violations we need to address." Jack nodded calmly. "I understand, officer, but is the tow truck really necessary?" By now, the crowd had swelled to over 50 people. Smartphones pointed at the scene from every angle, and the news crew had set up their camera. The female reporter was already doing a live introduction, gesturing dramatically toward the standoff. "This is Katie Chen reporting live from Wilshire Boulevard, where police appear to be in the process of impounding basketball legend Shaquille O'Neal's vehicle." Officer Wong approached Mercer, speaking in a low voice. "We should probably let him go with a warning. This is turning into a PR nightmare." But Mercer had already made his decision. He called in backup, requested a tow truck, and filed initial paperwork. To back down now would make the department look incompetent. Besides, the law was the law, regardless of celebrity status. "Mr. O'Neal," Mercer said formally, "your vehicle has illegal window tinting, unauthorized exhaust modifications, and custom lighting that violates state regulations. We'll need to impound the vehicle for inspection." Shaq's usually friendly face hardened. "You're serious? You're actually going to tow my car?" Eddie, the tow truck driver, looked as if he wanted to disappear. He shuffled his feet nervously, glancing between the officers and Shaq. "Just doing our job, sir," Mercer replied, though his confident tone masked inner doubt. Shaq slowly opened his door and began to unfold his massive frame from the vehicle. The crowd gasped audibly as he rose to his full height, towering over Officer Mercer. Even in casual clothes, Shaquille O'Neal's presence was overwhelming. "Do you know how much this car costs?" Shaq asked, his deep voice carrying to the crowd. "It's custom built for my size. You can't just hook it up to any tow truck." Eddie nodded emphatically. "He's right, officer. This is a specialized vehicle. My equipment might damage it." Officer Ramirez stepped closer to Mercer. "James, think about this. If anything happens to his car." But Mercer had reached the point of no return. "The law doesn't make exceptions for expensive cars or famous people," he said loudly enough for nearby phones to record. "The vehicle will be impounded until it passes proper inspection." The crowd's mood shifted palpably. Boos and shouts echoed from several directions. Someone yelled, "Leave Shaq alone." Shaq raised his massive hands, calming the crowd. Despite his obvious frustration, he maintained his composure. "It's all right, everyone. Let the officers do their job." He turned to face Mercer directly. "But understand this, if anything happens to my car, anything at all, there will be consequences." Eddie approached with his clipboard, looking miserable. "I need your signature, Mr. O'Neal. Standard procedure." As Shaq signed the form, a teenage boy broke through the crowd barrier. "Shaq, can I get a picture? My friends will never believe this." Surprisingly, Shaq smiled and posed with the boy, creating a surreal moment. The basketball star taking fan photos while his $300,000 custom car was being prepared for impoundment. Officer Wong whispered to Ramirez, "This is going to be all over the internet in 5 minutes. "Longer than that," Ramirez replied grimly. "This is the kind of story people don't forget." As Eddie carefully began connecting the tow equipment, Shaq made a phone call. His voice carried clearly in the now hushed atmosphere. "Yeah, it's me. They're really doing it. They're taking my car. Send someone to get me. And call the lawyers." Mercer watched as the custom sports car was slowly lifted. In his gut, he already knew this decision would follow him for the rest of his career. Eddie worked with unusual care as he secured the expensive sports car to his tow truck. His normal confidence was replaced by visible anxiety. One wrong move could damage a vehicle worth more than he'd earned in 5 years. The hydraulic lift whined under the weight of the custom car. "Easy does it," Eddie muttered to himself, triple-checking every connection point. Officer Mercer stood rigid, trying to ignore the hostile stares from the growing crowd. His decision was technically correct according to the law, but a voice in his head questioned if it was the right call. The police radio crackled with chatter as dispatch responded to the unusual situation unfolding on Wilshire Boulevard. "Unit 14, be advised, Captain Richards is requesting an update on the O'Neal vehicle impound." Mercer winced. News had already reached his commanding officer. This wasn't going to end well. Meanwhile, Shaq had stepped away from the immediate scene, his massive frame still visible above the crowd as he spoke animatedly on his phone. Even from a distance, his deep voice carried occasional words to the officers. "Ridiculous, perfectly legal modifications, burning my car." The news crew had positioned themselves strategically for the best angle, capturing both the basketball star's obvious displeasure and the police activity around his vehicle. The reporter was now interviewing bystanders. "They're treating him like a criminal," one woman told the camera. "If it was anyone else, they would just given a ticket." Officer Ramirez approached Mercer with a worried expression. "James, the captain's coming down personally. This is getting out of hand." Mercer nodded stiffly. "We follow procedure, regardless of who's involved." Just then, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled up behind the last police cruiser. The door opened, and a short, balding man in an expensive suit emerged, walking quickly toward the scene. He carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression that meant business. "Here comes trouble," Wong muttered. The man walked directly to Shaq, spoke briefly, then turned toward the officers. He approached with confident strides, stopping directly in front of Mercer. "Martin Goldstein, attorney for Mr. O'Neal," he announced, not offering his hand. "I need to speak with whoever's in charge of this situation." "That would be me, sir," Mercer replied, his mouth suddenly dry. Goldstein opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder. Officer, I have here complete documentation for every modification on Mr. O'Neal's vehicle, including special permits issued by the California DMV for the window tinting and custom suspension due to my client's unique physical requirements. He handed the folder to Mercer, who opened it with growing apprehension. Inside were official-looking permits, each bearing state seals and signatures. As you'll see, Goldstein continued, Mr. O'Neal's vehicle is not in violation of any regulations. The tinting is necessary due to his celebrity status and security concerns. The suspension modifications are required to accommodate his size. All perfectly legal, all properly documented. Mercer flipped through the papers, his stomach sinking with each page. Everything appeared legitimate. Ramirez looked over Mercer's shoulder. These seemed to be in order, he whispered. Eddie had paused his work, the car now half secured to the tow truck, suspended awkwardly between ground and full lift. Goldstein checked his watch. Officer, every minute that Mr. O'Neal's vehicle remains illegally impounded increases the department's liability. I suggest you make a decision quickly. The crowd had fallen silent, watching the drama unfold. Shaq stood with his arms crossed, observing from a distance. At that moment, a police cruiser with captain's insignia pulled up. Captain Richards, a 25-year veteran of the force, stepped out looking decidedly unhappy. Would someone like to explain why one of the most recognized people in Los Angeles is watching his car get towed on my streets? Richards asked, approaching the group. Mercer swallowed hard. This day, which had started so normally, was quickly becoming the most memorable, and possibly career-defining, of his life. And not in a good way. Goldstein smiled thinly. Captain, I was just explaining to your officer that this impoundment is completely unwarranted and needs to be reversed immediately. All eyes turned to Mercer, waiting for his response. Officer Mercer's career flashed before his eyes as Captain Richards reviewed the documents. The captain's face remained unreadable, years of police work having perfected his poker face, but the slight tightening around his eyes told Mercer everything he needed to know. Eddie, you can stand down, Richards finally said to the tow truck operator. We won't be impounding this vehicle today. Eddie couldn't hide his relief as he began the process of carefully lowering the sports car back to the pavement. Yes, sir, right away. But the damage was already done. The live news broadcast had been running for nearly 15 minutes. Social media was exploding with video clips and outraged comments. #ShaqScarborough was trending, even though the vehicle hadn't been damaged at all. In the world of viral news, perception quickly outran reality. Katie Chen, the news reporter, pushed closer with her microphone. Captain Richards, can you explain why your officers attempted to impound Shaquille O'Neal's legally modified vehicle? Was racial profiling involved? Richards raised his hand. No comment at this time. We're handling this matter internally. But the questions kept coming, from both media and the crowd. Is this how LAPD treats black celebrities? Would you have done this to a white driver? Why did it take 4 officers to handle one traffic stop? Across town, in the LAPD headquarters, phones were ringing nonstop. The department's social media accounts were flooded with angry messages. The mayor's office had already called twice, demanding explanations. Back at the scene, Shaq approached the group of officers, his attorney close by his side. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, phone cameras following his every move. Though his face remained composed, his eyes revealed his frustration. Captain, Shaq said, extending his hand. I appreciate you sorting this out. Richards shook the enormous hand, looking almost comically small next to the basketball legend. Mr. O'Neal, on behalf of the department, I apologize for the inconvenience. Inconvenience? Goldstein cut in sharply. Captain, your officers attempted to illegally seize my client's property despite being presented with valid documentation. That goes well beyond inconvenience. Shaq placed a calming hand on his attorney's shoulder. Martin, let's handle this properly, not here in the street. A wise decision, as 30-plus phones continued recording every word. Meanwhile, Officer Mercer stood rigidly at attention, awaiting the inevitable dressing down. His mind raced with potential consequences, desk duty, suspension, perhaps even demotion, all because he'd stubbornly insisted on following procedure without checking the documentation thoroughly. Richards turned to him. "Officer Mercer, we'll discuss this back at the station." Those simple words carried the weight of promised disciplinary action. Mercer nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." By noon, the story had reached national news. Sports networks picked it up first, then mainstream outlets. The headlines varied but carried the same sensational tone. LAPD burns Shaq. Basketball legend's car nearly impounded. Police target Shaq in traffic stop gone wrong. O'Neal's custom car almost burned by overzealous cops. The term burned took on a life of its own, morphing from slang for impounding to suggestions that officers had somehow damaged or attempted to destroy the vehicle. Facts became secondary to the outrage-fueled narrative. At his Bel Air home, Shaq watched the coverage with growing concern. What had started as a simple misunderstanding was spiraling into something much uglier. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, teammates, and other celebrities expressing solidarity. Charles Barkley texted, "Only you could make national news getting pulled over. Want me to come bail you out?" But Shaq didn't find it funny anymore. The officers had made a mistake, yes, but the public reaction was becoming dangerously overheated, fueled by existing tensions between police and communities of color. He turned to Goldstein. "We need to make a statement. This is getting out of hand." The LAPD conference room buzzed with nervous energy as Chief Wilson paced back and forth. Gathered around the large oak table were Captain Richards, Officers Mercer and Ramirez, the department's public relations director, and 2 city attorneys. A large screen on the wall displayed social media feeds updating in real time with the hashtag #ShaqScarBurned. "This is a disaster," Chief Wilson said, stopping to stare at the screen. "The mayor's office has called 3 times in the last hour." On the other side of Los Angeles, in a much more comfortable setting, Shaquille O'Neal sat in his home theater room with his manager, Attorney Goldstein, and a social media consultant. They watched the same feeds with equal concern. "The narrative is completely out of control," the consultant explained, scrolling through her tablet. "People think the police literally tried to set your car on fire." Shaq shook his head. "That's ridiculous. Nobody tried to burn anything." Goldstein adjusted his glasses. "It's slang, Shaq. Burned can mean impounded or towed in some communities, but the literal meaning is taking over online." Back at the police station, Officer Mercer sat rigid in his chair as the body camera footage played on the conference room screen. Every moment of the encounter was captured, from the initial stop to the confrontation with Goldstein. There, Captain Richards pointed at the screen. Officer Mercer clearly asked to see documentation for the modifications, but he proceeded with impoundment before thoroughly reviewing the permits. Mercer nodded, accepting the criticism. "I made a judgment call based on initial non-compliance. It was the wrong call." The PR director tapped her pen against the table. "The problem is, the public only saw the tow truck. They didn't see the conversation. We need to release this footage immediately." "And have the department look incompetent?" one of the city attorneys countered. Chief Wilson raised his hand for silence. "What we need is cooperation from Mr. O'Neal. If he would make a statement clarifying what actually happened." As if on cue, the PR director's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her eyebrows shot up. "Sir, you might want to see this. Shaq just posted a video statement on Instagram." She quickly connected her phone to the room's display. Shaq's face filled the screen, looking serious but calm. "Hey everyone, Shaq here. I want to clear something up about what happened today. Despite what you might have heard, the LAPD did not try to burn my car. That's crazy talk. There was a misunderstanding about the legal modifications on my vehicle. The officers were doing their job, checking that everything was up to code." Shaq continued, his deep voice carrying authority. "Yes, they called a tow truck before checking all my paperwork. That wasn't cool. But let's be real, nobody tried to damage my property or disrespect me personally. Let's bring the temperature down on this, okay? Big diesel out." The room fell silent as the video ended. The PR director smiled for the first time that day. This could change everything. Indeed, within minutes, the online conversation began to shift. Sports reporters praised Shaq's maturity. Comment sections filled with discussions about the actual events rather than imagined scenarios. At his home, Shaq put down his phone and turned to his team. It was the right thing to do. Those officers made a mistake, but they don't deserve to have their careers ruined over it. Meanwhile, a local news channel had obtained footage from a bystander showing the entire incident from a different angle. This video clearly showed the careful way Hetty had handled the sports car, contradicting claims that police had been reckless with Shaq's property. By evening, most major news outlets had corrected their initial reporting. O'Neal diffuses tension after police encounter replaced the sensational headlines from earlier in the day. Officer Mercer watched the coverage from his apartment, relief washing over him. He still faced disciplinary action, but Shaq's statement had prevented a potential career-ending scandal. His phone buzzed with a text from Ramirez. "Shaq just saved your job, man." Mercer couldn't argue with that. Sometimes truth was the best defense, especially when it came from an unexpected ally. The morning after the incident, Shaquille O'Neal's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Every major news outlet wanted an exclusive interview. ESPN, CNN, Fox News, and even international media had sent requests. His publicist had organized the calls into a priority list, but Shaq had other ideas. "Cancel all the interviews," he told her, his deep voice firm but gentle. "I'm going to handle this my way." His publicist looked concerned. "Are you sure? This is a chance to control the narrative." Shaq smiled. "Trust me, I've been handling the media since before social media existed." At the Los Angeles Police Department headquarters, Officer James Mercer sat uncomfortably in a hard plastic chair outside the Internal Affairs office. His disciplinary hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m., and his stomach churned with anxiety. His career hung in the balance. Officer Ramirez rounded the corner, surprise on his face. "Mercer? I thought your hearing wasn't until tomorrow." "They moved it up," Mercer replied grimly. "The department wants this resolved quickly." The elevator doors opened, and Captain Richards stepped out, his face as unreadable as ever. "Officer Mercer, the hearing is delayed. There's something you need to see first." Confused, Mercer followed his captain to the conference room. Several high-ranking officials were already seated, their eyes fixed on the television mounted on the wall. The morning news was playing. "Breaking news this morning," the anchor announced. "NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal has just arrived at the Los Angeles Police Department's Central Division. Sources tell us he requested this meeting personally." The screen showed live footage of Shaq's unmistakable figure entering the police station, dressed in a tailored suit that somehow managed to contain his massive frame. Unlike yesterday, he wasn't accompanied by lawyers, just his manager and a small gym bag. "What's he doing here?" Mercer whispered to no one in particular. 20 minutes later, the conference room door opened. Captain Richards entered with an unexpected guest, Shaquille O'Neal himself. Everyone stood immediately. "Gentlemen, ladies," Shaq nodded to the room. "Thank you for seeing me." Chief Wilson stepped forward. "Mr. O'Neal, this is highly unusual, but we appreciate your willingness to discuss yesterday's incident." Shaq's eyes found Mercer in the crowd. "Actually, I'm not here to complain. I'm here to make things right." He placed the gym bag on the table and opened it. Inside was a basketball. "Officer Mercer," Shaq said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "Yesterday was rough for both of us. You were doing your job, checking on vehicle modifications that seemed suspicious. I wasn't as cooperative as I could have been at first." Mercer stood straighter, unsure how to respond. "Sir, I should have verified your documentation more thoroughly before calling the tow truck." Shaq nodded. "We both could have handled things better, but that's not why I'm here." He lifted the basketball from the bag. "I'm here because I respect people who stand by their decisions, even when it's hard." The room fell silent as Shaq uncapped a marker and began signing the basketball. "Throughout my career, I've made tough calls that weren't always popular. Sometimes I was right, sometimes I was wrong, but I always took responsibility either way." He finished signing and held the ball out to Officer Mercer. "This incident could divide people, or it could bring them together. I choose the second option." Mercer accepted the basketball with slightly trembling hands. Written on it were the words, "To Officer Mercer, respect isn't given, it's earned. Today you earned mine, Shaq." The gesture was unexpected and powerful. Several officers blinked back emotion. Shaq wasn't finished. "I've requested to speak to the press with Officer Mercer to show that we can disagree about a situation without turning it into something bigger than it is. Chief Wilson looked stunned. That's incredibly generous of you, Mr. O'Neal. Call me Shaq, he replied with his famous grin. Everyone does, and it's not generosity, it's just the right thing to do. Mercer stared at the sign ball, then at the basketball legend who had every reason to be angry, but had chosen reconciliation instead. Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say. Shaq's smile widened. Say you'll join me at the press conference, and maybe play some one-on-one after. I hear you were pretty good in college. For the first time in 24 hours, Officer James Mercer smiled. 6 months after the infamous car burning incident, Officer James Mercer parked his patrol car outside the newly renovated community center in South Los Angeles. The building had once been an abandoned warehouse, but now sported fresh paint, new windows, and a large, colorful mural depicting children of all backgrounds playing basketball together. Above the entrance, bold letters spelled out Respect Center, building bridges through understanding. It was a physical reminder of how an uncomfortable encounter had transformed into something positive. Mercer checked his watch. The ribbon-cutting ceremony would begin in 30 minutes. He straightened his dress uniform and made his way inside. The main hall buzzed with activity. City officials mingled with community leaders, journalists set up cameras, and excited children darted between adults. Officer Mercer called a familiar deep voice. Shaquille O'Neal waved from across the room, towering over everyone else. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Mercer's monthly salary, but his warm smile made him approachable despite his celebrity status. Good to see you, Shaq, Mercer said, shaking the enormous hand. After months of working together on this project, the formality between them had long since disappeared. Ready for the big speech? Shaq asked, glancing at the podium set up at the front of the room. Mercer touched the index cards in his pocket. As ready as I'll ever be. Public speaking isn't exactly what they trained me for at the academy. You'll do fine, Shaq assured him. Just speak from the heart, like we practiced. The weeks following their initial confrontation had been a whirlwind. Their joint press conference had gone viral for all the right reasons. Instead of fueling division, they had shown how conflict could lead to understanding. News outlets that had initially reported sensational versions of the story published retractions and follow-up pieces about their unexpected friendship. Captain Richards approached, looking pleased. Quite a turnout. The mayor just arrived, and I think I spotted the governor's car outside. This is bigger than just us now, Shaq nodded. That's exactly what we wanted. The incident had sparked important conversations within the LAPD. Training protocols for traffic stops were revised, with special emphasis on verification procedures before impoundment. Officer Mercer, rather than being disciplined, had become an unlikely spokesperson for these reforms. At precisely noon, the ceremony began. After brief introductions, Shaq and Mercer took the stage together. 6 months ago, Shaq began, his voice easily filling the room without a microphone. Officer Mercer and I met under less than ideal circumstances. Laughter rippled through the audience. What could have become another story of division instead became a lesson in communication and respect. Mercer stepped up to the microphone. As police officers, we're trained to follow procedures, but sometimes we forget that behind every interaction is a human being with their own story. He paused, looking out at the diverse faces watching him. This center represents what happens when we take the time to listen to those stories. The Respect Center wasn't just a building. It housed programs bringing police officers and community members together in non-enforcement settings. Basketball leagues where officers coached local kids, workshop spaces for conflict resolution training, and meeting rooms where citizens and police could discuss concerns openly. After the speeches and the ribbon cutting, as guests toured the facility, Officer Ramirez approached Mercer with a grin. Remember when you thought your career was over? Now look at you, the department's poster boy for community relations. Mercer shook his head, still amazed by the turn of events. All because I tried to tow the wrong car. Across the room, Eddie the tow truck driver was showing the group of teenagers the proper way to secure a vehicle without causing damage. He volunteered his expertise for the center's automotive program. As the day went down, Shaq found a quiet moment with Mercer in the center's new basketball court. You know, Shaq said, bouncing a ball thoughtfully, sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the best outcomes. Mercer watched the ball arc perfectly through the hoop. I never thought I'd be grateful for the worst day of my career. Shaq smiled. Not the worst day, just the beginning of something better. And as they looked around at what their partnership had created, both men knew that this story, which had started with misunderstanding and could have ended with division, had instead become a blueprint for turning conflict into connection.